Morticians of Reddit. What is the most bizarre, uncomfortable, creepy, etc. case or situation you've had to deal with? Please do like, share, and subscribe. A writing professor of mine used to work in small-town journalism and decided to interview some folks from the local retirement home to get a close-up view of his town's history. One of his interviews was an ancient retired mortician who told him a rather interesting story. Shortly before 1920, two teens were going to a school dance in a blizzard. The carriage they had taken got stranded and the boy went for help. The girl unfortunately froze to death in the carriage, in an upright, seated position. Apparently, the mortician had to sit her in a rocking chair in front of the fire to thaw her out before he could go about his usual business. I was a student at the time, but my first ever bloater was brought in, and once we popped him, insides were outsides and everywhere. Would not recommend. On my first night shift, I thought staff were fucking with me because I kept hearing what sounded like breathing. Fresh body brought in and was releasing gas. I'd never dealt with anyone dying in the hour being brought in, so it was scary hearing this body breathing. I've been there when family members have passed and witnessed breathing and limbs moving, so I know it's normal, but as a student, the staff like to fuck with you. Bizarre one was piecing a guy back together after he committed suicide by gunshot to the face. Family wanted an open casket. Had to try our best, then ask one family member in to see if they still wanted open casket because we just didn't feel like it was right. Dad comes in, sees that no matter how we tried, we couldn't make him look the same as before, and agrees that family shouldn't see him this way. The day we delivered him to the funeral parlor, family changes their mind and has open casket anyway. Found out rest of the family didn't know he shot himself in the face. We ended up getting a letter of complaint from other members of the family for the open casket. I finished as a student a few days after, but would still love to be in that career though. Uncomfortable? Being trapped in the morgue alone during a hurricane. Our morgue was basically in a basement type situation, and the hospital was near a main waterway that flooded. I had to move all the bodies to the highest cabinets, pray the generators would keep everyone cold, and was standing on my desk for about 2 hours when someone finally came for me. Bizarre would be drowned guy who was DOA, and once locked up in the cabinet, a tapping noise started coming from him. It was a crab that had made itself at home inside him, and when it got cold, he wanted out. Creepy was when we got some people who were doing bath salts and had eaten other people. They looked crazy, even in death. Heard on the news a friend from my youth had been killed. I was terribly sad for him. He could never escape his demons and it led him down some terrible paths. Came into work a few nights later and there he was, face completely bashed in by a rock. This wasn't the first time someone I knew ended up in our morgue, but certainly the saddest. Dad was a coroner, if I recall correctly, before switching to doctor. I can never remember the details correctly for the medical stuff, but pretty much the body getting examined was a former birthday clown. There weren't any external wounds, so he figured the cause of death was internal. The guy had gastroparesis, which to my dad meant cool stomach contents should be in good shape. His team opens the dude up and sees this flurry of fuck. There's partially digested birthday cake, that edible confetti stuff, fucking streamers, and about a dozen pills of Xanax next to all of it. Dad sifts through the stomach some more and sees what looks like a sponge of some kind. He pulls one out, and it's a fucking sponge dino that comes in those capsules you drop in the water. He finds more, about a small biome's worth. He thought he was getting fucking pranked. The story pieced together as the clown decided to end it with the Xanax and booze. He gets a store-bought cake and eats it with everything on it, then chases down with some dino sponges just for the hell of it. Doesn't exactly fit the criteria, but I'm gonna tell the story anyway. I come from a smallish town. We have one mortician and everyone knows him. His daughter dated my cousin during this period of time. 1 year. A different cousin got into a bad car accident right outside of the county and died on impact. Of course, they called it in and he was asked to come down to the scene and retrieve the body. He was told the estimated age of the girl, the make of her vehicle, and which direction she was driving on the highway. The age and vehicle make matched that of his daughter, who was visiting her boyfriend at the time. He couldn't get a hold of his daughter, so he showed up at the scene fully prepared to be picking up his own child. Sadly enough, this scared him so badly that this was the last funeral he ever performed. 8 years later, and he still visits my deceased cousin's parents regularly just to check in. It's clearly stuck with him. Not a mortician. This comes from my mother back when she was a teenager. Guy she knows takes a job with the local funeral home. He works the graveyard shift. All was well for the first few months. Dude is often weirded out at work, claims that the building is haunted. Earlier in the evening, they get a call from the hospital saying that they have a lady there ready for pickup. They pick her up. Guy is freaking out, says he has a bad feeling. Later in the evening, Mortician has to step out for a bit, leaving Guy there alone with the dead lady. He goes about his work, still a little freaked out. Suddenly, he hears this low, soft moan. He swears it is just his mind playing tricks on him, goes about his business. He hears it again, little louder than last time. It is late. He is alone. He's just hearing things. Probably just the pipes settling. The plumbing is old after all. Short time passes and it is louder. At this point, he is sure he isn't just imagining things. He knows he heard the dead lady moan. His first thought was that the mortician was fucking with him. He has been shaken all evening and this asshole is pranking him. He marches over. "Very funny, you dick." Yanks back the sheet covering the dead lady, expecting to find the mortician somewhere around her. Dead lady grabs the guy's wrist. He lets out this scream and bolts for the door. Forgets his car, runs all the way home. Turns out, old lady wasn't dead. Hospital got it wrong. Hooray, 1950s medicine. She had been in a coma or something, and they had been sure she had passed on earlier that evening. She woke up at the funeral home and scared the ever-loving hell out of the assistant. He quit the next day, said he would never set foot there again. My ex-in-laws were in the death business. They told me a story about the county attorney whose wife passed away. The family was very wealthy, and she had a mouth full of gold fillings. The attorney demanded that my in-laws retrieve the gold from her mouth. This required using a dental drill to drill down her teeth and dig out the gold. My ex-father-in-law complied with the attorney's wishes, but was physically ill about having to do such a needless step to this lady. My dad is a mortician. We had actually lived above the funeral, and my life had been just like my girl. He had been a mortician for over 40 years and has tons of stories. The worst by far is the human soup guy. Apparently, this elderly gentleman passed away while having a bath, with the water still running. He was living alone in the house with very little family. I don't remember how long he was in the bath before someone found him. My dad goes to pick up the body, and it's human soup. The hot water constantly running, and the amount of time caused his body to turn to mush. He said the smell was the worst he ever smelled. He got back to the office later that day, and his boss told him to throw away his suit, and he'd buy him another. I work with the dead, procure eyes and corneas for transplant. While I was working on one guy at the medical examiner's office, they brought in another guy whose cat had eaten his face clean. Just his face, nothing else. It was a sort of decaying but still somewhat normal-looking dude with a bright Halloween-looking skull picked clean. Lots of murder victims, gunshots, car accidents, even one train accident. A guy who hanged himself in front of his kids with a dog leash, which was still in the bag with the body. High-caliber self-inflicted gunshot wound to the face, with teeth and jaw and bits everywhere, and a bunch of gauze stuffed into the remaining hole. Let's not forget the guy in the decomp room, who was just a pile of bones, hair, and leathery tissue paired with a bucket of goo. Crazy stuff, but never a dull day. Well, this was not really a mortuary, but I was a student many years ago in the anthropology department at the University of Tennessee. Dr. Bill Bass, a sort of P.T. Barnum of forensic anthropology, not a faker, but a hell of a promoter, was the department head, and a major focus of the department was forensic anthropology. This was also before DNA testing, so skeletal forensics was essential in identifying bodies that were partially decayed. Dr. Bass would get about 15 to 20 cases every year, decayed or skeletal remains, to hopefully identify or at least profile race, sex, approximate age, any distinguishing characteristics, and sometimes cause of death. Usually these were vagrants, crime victims, or just historic or prehistoric Native American remains. One time, in West Tennessee, they found a clothed but fully skeletonized body in a patch of dense vegetation in a little town in West Tennessee. The local sheriff and coroner loaded the body in the back of a pickup truck and drove the corpse all the way across the state, 400 miles, to Knoxville, so Dr. Bass could do an ID. When the truck arrived, Dr. Bass went out and opened the body bag to find a complete skeleton that remained fully dressed. He looked the body up and down, and then reached into the front pocket of the corpse's jeans and pulled out a wallet, which he opened to read off the name, address, race, height, and hair and eye color of the deceased. The sheriff and the coroner were a bit embarrassed. It turned out the dead guy had only been missing for about a week, but in the dense foliage of a West Tennessee thicket in midsummer, the bugs and beetles had completely stripped his bones of flesh. Bass did do a follow-up to make sure the driver's license and the corpse were a match. Dr. Bass had many interesting cases. He founded the infamous Body Farm, has written several books, fiction and nonfiction, and is featured in fictional form in many of Patricia Cornwell's crime novels. Licensed embalmer here. I've worked for large funeral homes and did coroner removals for a decently large city and currently work as a trade embalmer. I've had lots of suicides embalmed, a 4-year-old that a cop blew a stop sign and T-boned their minivan. That one really hurt, but the one that was weird was this. 18-year-old girl hung herself, so I do the embalming like normal, even though it sucked having to do it. Now, the weird part, I get a text from my friends a few hours later saying that another one of our friend's fiance's sisters killed herself, and if I knew anything about it, which really sucks because my friend's wedding is in 4 days. Turns out that 18-year-old was the sister to the bride. So I have to go to the wedding 4 days later while everyone is still grieving the loss and keep my mouth shut, and I'm the one that embalmed her. This was in a town of about 250,000 people. Worked in a mortuary for a few months because I needed a job and it was at night. My job pretty much was checking the bodies as they were brought in and put them in cold storage. One night, they brought in 2 bodies, back to back, from a convalescing home. I didn't have time to put the first away yet, so I put it off to the side while I signed in the new delivery. The people leave and I go back to the first body and notice that it wasn't exactly as I left it. When I left it, the body was flat on its back, and when I got back, it was sorta scrunched up. I backed the fuck out of the room and just sat down. The mortician came out and saw me pale as a ghost. I told him what happened and he laughed. He then proceeded to explain to me, sometimes the bodies will curl up after death because of rigor mortis, and after that's done, it'll go back to being limp. He proceeded to tell me that some cases are so bad that the bodies sit straight up. Fuck that. He ended up putting the bodies away, and I spent the rest of the night freaked out. Oh man, I might be late, but this is good. We picked up a suicide on a major holiday, Thanksgiving or Christmas, I can't remember. Took her back to the funeral home, undressed her, and had to wait for a medical examiner. Family decides to cremate. We had dressed her for a viewing. Everything was normal. Later that day, she was ready to be cremated. I put her in, start the machine, and went back inside. I had to embalm someone else. About an hour in, I heard like 5 loud pops. First thought was a pacemaker, brain stimulator, something I'd missed. I let it finish, swept it into the tray, and a fucking small handgun came out. Now I had seen all of her. Seriously, where did she have that at? The only spot is inside her vagina. The question is why? It's been 10 plus years, and I'm still WTF. Not a mortician, but a gravedigger. I was 18. It was my first full-time job. I was learning the ropes, and the boss man told me to mark out a grave. A wife was joining her husband, many decades after his internment. My coworker taught me how to spec out an adjoining gravesite, split the tombstone in half, move over 6 inches, then plot the new grave with string in the prescribed dimensions. I did that. Then the backhoe arrived. As the backhoe guy dug the grave, a problem emerged. We could see bones in the dirt. My coworker stopped the backhoe guy and started yelling at me. I told him I marked the site exactly as he said, 6 inches to the left of the center of the marker, then 3 feet wide, 8 feet long, etc. I did as I was told, but it appears the husband wasn't sighted correctly and was not buried in a vault. His cheap pine coffin had rotted and he was everywhere, but it was still all my fault, apparently. The backhoe dug down an extra foot into the husband's side of the site. I was tasked to jump in and reinter all the bones on his side of the site. So I jumped in and packed all those bones and dirt into his side. My coworker and the backhoe guy had a laugh while yelling at me about bones I had missed and making me pack them in. We walled up his side of the grave nice and even, then overpacked it a bit and finished up the wife's grave. It was some grisly shit, man. But hey, it was 1982, and I was making $10 an hour, which was big money. With great wealth comes great responsibilities. Most bizarre, particularly difficult family. None of them could agree at all on what to do with their dad. One faction wanted burial, the other was demanding cremation. After much shouting, they finally agreed on a compromise. They wanted us to cut their father's body in half. That way one half could be cremated and the other half buried. I had to explain to the unfortunate arranger, who at this point looked beyond exhausted, that no, we could not saw a human body in half because that would be very illegal and very messy. Most uncomfortable, I'm 5'3" and was about 120 at the time. I was sent on a removal at a private residence with my supervisor. We get there, and the family of the deceased consisted of half a dozen or so very tall men, every one of them well over 6 feet tall. Coincidentally, my supervisor was also male and unusually tall. They greeted him cordially, but as soon as I entered the home, it was like a switch was thrown. Every single one of them looked at me with pure contempt. I was not spoken to, only stared and glared at. They would not allow me to touch their father or grandfather. I was shouldered out of the way and blocked by the grandsons. I don't intimidate easily, but I had a wall of hostile giants staring me down from inches away. Once the deceased was on the gurney, they refused to even allow me to push. They assisted my supervisor themselves. It was really, really uncomfortable. The only thing that my supervisor and I could think of was that they didn't think I was strong enough to lift the body. Being small, I got that from time to time, but people were usually trying to be helpful. This was pure anger and hostility.